14 years, 5,210 days of showing up early, staying late, and building someone else's dream into a multi-million-dollar reality. And my boss, Keaton Ashford, thought he could slash my salary by 40% with a casual Friday afternoon meeting. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't just his director of operations. I was the person who knew where every body was buried, every shortcut he'd taken, and every corner he'd cut to build his empire. When I walked into his office that Monday morning with my resignation letter, I also brought something else, an ultimatum that would either make him the most generous boss in hospitality or the most bankrupt. My name is Thalia, and I learned the hard way that loyalty without leverage is just another word for exploitation. But I also learned that 14 years of watching someone build a business teaches you exactly how to tear it down. Let me start from the beginning, because this isn't just a story about a pay cut. It's about what happens when someone mistakes your dedication for desperation and discovers that the person they've been taking advantage of holds all the cards they didn't even know they were playing. I started working at Ashford Events when I was 24 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in business administration and absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with my life. The company was barely a company then, just Keaton, his business partner Marcus, and 2 part-time employees running corporate events out of a converted warehouse in Atlanta. They needed someone to handle administrative work, coordinate with vendors, and basically keep track of all the details that creative people tend to forget. The job paid $32,000 a year, which wasn't much even in 2010, but I was young, eager, and frankly grateful to have any job in a market where most of my friends were moving back in with their parents. Keaton seemed passionate about building something special, and the work was varied enough to keep me interested. One day I'd be negotiating contracts with caterers, the next I'd be designing floor plans for product launches, and the next I'd be managing registration for 1,000-person conferences. What started as administrative support gradually evolved into operational management. I learned every aspect of the business because I had to. We were too small to have specialized roles, so everyone did everything. I negotiated vendor contracts, managed client relationships, coordinated logistics, handled finances, and basically kept the company running while Keaton and Marcus focused on sales and creative development. By my 3rd year, Ashford Events had grown from a 2-person startup to a legitimate event management company with 15 employees and clients like Coca-Cola, Home Depot, and the Atlanta Hawks. We were handling everything from intimate executive retreats to massive trade shows, and our reputation for flawless execution was attracting attention from major corporations across the Southeast. I was promoted to operations manager with a raise to $48,000, plus a small bonus structure tied to company performance. More importantly, I was given real authority over vendor relationships, staff scheduling, and project execution. Keaton trusted me to make decisions that could affect hundreds of thousands of dollars in client commitments, and I never let him down. By year 5, I was essentially running the operational side of the business, while Keaton focused on expansion, and Marcus handled creative strategy. We had 30 employees, offices in Atlanta and Nashville, and annual revenue approaching $8 million. My salary had increased to $65,000, which still felt low for the responsibility I was carrying, but I believed in the company's trajectory and trusted that my compensation would eventually reflect my contributions. That trust turned out to be misplaced. Over the next 9 years, Ashford Events grew into one of the premier event management companies in the Southeast. We expanded to Charlotte, Miami, and New Orleans. We added corporate training, destination events, and virtual conference services to our offerings. We built relationships with major hotels, convention centers, and vendors that gave us pricing power and preferential access that our competitors couldn't match. Through all of this growth, I was the constant. I hired and trained most of our operational staff. I developed the systems and processes that allowed us to scale without sacrificing quality. I negotiated the vendor relationships that kept our costs competitive and our service levels high. I managed the logistics that turned creative concepts into flawless events that generated glowing testimonials and repeat business. By 2024, Ashford Events was generating $23 million in annual revenue. We employed over 100 people across 5 cities. We were handling some of the most prestigious corporate events in the region, including annual conferences for Fortune 500 companies and product launches that attracted national media attention. and I was making $96,000 a year. Don't get me wrong, $96,000 is good money. But when you're the person responsible for the operational success of a company that's generating $23 million in revenue, when you're managing relationships worth millions of dollars, when you're the institutional knowledge that makes everything else possible, it starts to feel inadequate, especially when you know that comparable positions at similar companies are paying 30 to 50% more. I had raised this issue with Keaton multiple times over the past 2 years. I'd presented market research showing what directors of operations earned at comparable event management companies. I'd documented my contributions to the company's growth and profitability. I'd outlined the value I brought to vendor relationships, client retention, and operational efficiency. Each time, Keaton had given me variations of the same response. The company was investing heavily in expansion, cash flow was tight, and he would address my compensation once we reached certain growth milestones. Meanwhile, he was driving a new BMW, had bought a vacation home in Hilton Head, and was funding his son's private school tuition that cost more than my annual salary. I should have seen the warning signs when he hired Daphne Carrington as chief financial officer 6 months ago. Daphne came from a larger corporate environment, where she'd apparently specialized in operational efficiency and cost optimization. She had an MBA from Emory, a wardrobe that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, and absolutely no understanding of how the event management business actually worked. Her first week on the job, she scheduled individual meetings with every department head to understand our current operational structure and identify opportunities for improved financial performance. When my turn came, I spent 2 hours walking her through our vendor relationships, explaining our pricing strategies, and detailing the operational processes that allowed us to deliver consistent results for demanding clients. "Thalia," she said, reviewing notes on her iPad, "I have to say, this operational structure seems quite complex. Are all these vendor relationships really necessary? And these staffing levels? They seem high compared to industry benchmarks I'm familiar with." I explained that event management requires redundancy and relationship depth because we're dealing with live events where failure isn't an option. Our vendor relationships weren't just about getting competitive pricing. They were about having partners who would prioritize our events when equipment broke, weather-caused problems, or last-minute changes required immediate solutions. "I understand the theory," Daphne said. "But from a financial perspective, I'm seeing opportunities to streamline operations and reduce overhead. We might be able to achieve similar results with fewer resources and more efficient processes." That should have been my first clue that trouble was coming. Over the next few months, Daphne implemented a series of efficiency initiatives that gradually eroded the operational advantages we'd built over 14 years. She renegotiated vendor contracts to save money, but lost the preferential treatment that had allowed us to handle complex events with confidence. She reduced staffing levels to cut payroll costs, but increased the workload on remaining employees to the point where quality started to suffer. Most concerning, she started questioning expenses that were essential to our operational success. The relationships lunches that maintained vendor partnerships became unnecessary entertainment costs. The backup equipment rentals that ensured flawless event execution became redundant insurance expenses. The additional staffing that allowed us to handle last-minute client changes became inefficient resource allocation. I tried to explain to Keaton that these changes were undermining the foundation of our success, but he was completely enamored with Daphne's financial analysis and cost reduction achievements. She was saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, and he couldn't see that she was also destroying the operational excellence that justified our premium pricing. The breaking point came last Friday afternoon. Keaton asked me to join him and Daphne in his office for what he described as an important conversation about your role and compensation going forward. I walked in expecting finally to have the salary discussion I'd been requesting for 2 years. Instead, I got the most insulting proposal of my professional career. "Thalia," Keaton began, "Daphne and I have been reviewing our operational structure and compensation levels across the organization. We've identified some opportunities to better align individual compensation with current market conditions and company performance." Daphne pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk to me. "We've restructured your position to better reflect the streamlined operational responsibilities we've implemented over the past 6 months." I opened the folder and saw a new job description titled operations coordinator, with a salary of $57,000. $57,000. A 40% pay cut that would take me back to what I was making in 2018, despite the company's revenue having doubled since then. I don't understand, I said, though I understood perfectly. Are you demoting me? We're right-sizing your role, Daphne said smoothly. The operational efficiencies we've implemented have reduced the scope of responsibilities that require senior-level oversight. This restructured position better reflects the actual work requirements. I looked at the job description. Everything I had built over 14 years, the vendor relationships, the client management, the strategic planning, had been stripped away or assigned to other departments. What remained was basically administrative coordination with no real authority or decision-making responsibility. Keaton, I said, I've been with this company for 14 years. I've helped you build this business from a 2-person startup to a $23 million operation. I know every vendor, every client, every process that makes this company successful. And you want to cut my salary by 40%? Thalia, I understand this is disappointing, he said, but we have to make decisions based on business realities, not sentiment. The market has changed. Our operational needs have evolved. And we need compensation structures that reflect current requirements rather than historical contributions. Historical contributions. 14 years of building his business reduced to historical contributions. What if I don't accept this restructuring? I asked. Daphne answered before Keaton could speak. Obviously, we hope you'll see the value in continuing with the organization, but we understand if you feel this opportunity isn't aligned with your career goals. They were firing me without firing me. Offering me a job they knew I couldn't accept, so they could say I had chosen to leave, rather than acknowledging they were pushing out someone who knew more about their business than they did. I need to think about this, I said. Of course, Keaton said. Take the weekend. Let me know your decision on Monday. I walked out of that office with my hands shaking and my mind racing. 14 years of loyalty, and this was how it ended. Not with gratitude or recognition, but with a calculated attempt to force me out while minimizing their severance obligations. That weekend, I did 3 things. First, I called a labor attorney to understand my rights and options. Second, I updated my resume and reached out to contacts at competing event management companies. Third, I made a list of everything I knew about Ashford events that Keaton and Daphne probably wished I didn't know. That list was longer than I expected. I knew that we were violating several vendor contracts by using unauthorized subcontractors to reduce costs. I knew that we had been overbilling certain clients for services that were being provided at reduced rates. I knew that our insurance coverage had gaps that could expose the company to massive liability if anything went wrong at our events. I knew that several of our major vendor relationships were dependent on personal connections that would disappear if I left. Most importantly, I knew that 3 of our biggest clients had specifically told me they worked with Ashford Events because they trusted me personally to manage their events. These weren't just accounts. They represented over $6 million in annual revenue. Monday morning, I walked into Keaton's office with 2 documents, my resignation letter and what I privately called my ultimatum. Keaton, I said, I've thought about your offer and I'm afraid I can't accept a 40% pay cut for doing the same job I've been doing for 14 years. I'm sorry to hear that, he said, but he didn't look particularly surprised. We'll miss having you on the team. Actually, I said, before you accept my resignation, there are a few things you should know about what happens when I leave. I pulled out a folder and set it on his desk. This is a summary of the vendor relationships, client accounts, and operational knowledge that I'll be taking with me. Keaton opened the folder and started reading. I watched his expression change from polite regret to confusion to something approaching panic. First, I said, the vendor relationships. Our preferred pricing with Continental Catering is based on a personal relationship I've built with their owner over 8 years. Same with Spotlight Audiovisual, Premier Tent and Event, and basically every other vendor we depend on for competitive pricing and preferential treatment. Those relationships don't transfer automatically. They'll need to be rebuilt from scratch. I flipped to the next page. Second, the client accounts. Morrison Financial, Peachtree Hospitality, and Meridian Healthcare have all told me explicitly that they work with Ashford Events because they trust me to manage their events. Morrison's CFO actually told me last month that if I ever left the company, they'd follow me wherever I went. Keaton was reading faster now, and his face was getting paler with each page. Third, the operational knowledge. I know which vendors can handle last-minute changes, which ones require extra supervision, which hotels have hidden fees, which convention centers have problematic loading docks, and basically every other detail that allows us to execute flawless events. None of that is documented anywhere except in my head. I leaned forward. Fourth, the compliance issues. I know about the unauthorized subcontractors, the billing irregularities, the insurance gaps, and the contract violations that Daphne's efficiency initiatives have created. I know which shortcuts you've taken and which corners you've cut to maintain profitability. The room was completely silent. Keaton had stopped reading and was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Now, I continued, I want to be very clear. I'm not threatening to sabotage the company or violate any confidentiality agreements. I'm simply explaining the practical consequences of losing someone who has been central to your operations for 14 years. I stood up. So here's my alternative proposal. You can accept my resignation and deal with the operational disruption, client defections, vendor relationship issues, and potential compliance problems that will follow. Or you can tear up that ridiculous job restructuring, give me the compensation that reflects my actual value to this company, and we can pretend this conversation never happened. What kind of compensation are you talking about? Keaton asked quietly. Director of Operations, $130,000 base salary, plus performance bonuses tied to client retention and operational efficiency, and a formal employment contract that protects both of us from future misunderstandings about my role and value. That's a 35% increase, he said. It's market rate for someone with my experience managing operations for a company of this size, I replied. Check the salary surveys. Check what your competitors are paying. Check what it would cost to replace me and rebuild everything I've created. I set my resignation letter on his desk. You have until 5 o'clock today to decide. If I don't hear from you by then, I'll assume you're accepting my resignation, and I'll start making calls to inform vendors and clients about my departure. I walked out without waiting for a response. The next 6 hours were the longest of my professional career. I sat at my desk, trying to focus on normal work while wondering if I had just ended my career or saved it. I had never made an ultimatum like that before, and I wasn't sure if I had overplayed my hand or finally played it correctly. At 4:30, my phone rang. It was Keaton. Thalia, can you come to my office? I'd like to discuss your proposal. I walked into his office to find Keaton alone. No Daphne, no folder of restructuring documents, just him looking like someone who had spent the day calculating the cost of losing his most valuable employee. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, and I realize I may have underestimated the scope of your contributions to this company. I think you underestimated the consequences of losing those contributions, I said. That too, he admitted. I spoke with our insurance broker about the coverage gaps you mentioned. I called Morrison Financial to discuss their upcoming annual conference. I reached out to Continental Catering about next month's pricing renewal. He paused. Every conversation confirmed what you told me this morning. You're not just our director of operations. You're the foundation that everything else is built on. So what are you proposing? I'm proposing that we tear up Daphne's restructuring plan and start over. Director of Operations, $130,000 base salary, performance bonuses, and a 3-year employment contract that gives you the job security you deserve. I looked at him carefully. And what about Daphne's efficiency initiatives? We're going to review every change she's implemented and reverse anything that compromises our operational capabilities or vendor relationships. You'll have full authority to rebuild whatever was damaged and prevent future interference with operational decisions. I want that in writing, I said. Of course. 2 weeks later, I signed a 3-year employment contract that not only restored my authority and increased my compensation, but also gave me equity participation in the company's growth. Daphne's operational efficiency initiatives were systematically reversed, vendor relationships were repaired, and client confidence was restored. But the most satisfying part wasn't the salary increase or the job security. It was the realization that 14 years of loyalty had given me something more valuable than money: leverage. 6 months later, Ashford Events reported the highest revenue and profitability in company history. Our client retention rate increased to 97%. Our vendor relationships were stronger than ever. And our operational efficiency, real efficiency, not the paper shuffling kind that Daphne had implemented, reached new levels. Keaton and I never discussed that Monday morning ultimatum again, but our relationship changed permanently. He stopped taking my contributions for granted, started consulting me on major strategic decisions, and began treating me like the business partner I had effectively been for years. Daphne left the company 3 months later to pursue new opportunities in financial consulting. I heard she took a position with a smaller firm where her cost-cutting expertise would be more appreciated. As for me, I learned something valuable about the difference between loyalty and leverage. Loyalty without leverage is just exploitation waiting to happen. But when you've spent 14 years building someone else's success, you've also built the knowledge and relationships that make you irreplaceable. The key is recognizing your own value before someone else tries to diminish it. I still work at Ashford Events, but now as a true partner, rather than just an employee. I own a piece of the company I helped build, earn compensation that reflects my contributions, and have the job security that comes from being genuinely irreplaceable, rather than just hoping to be appreciated. And I keep that resignation letter in my desk drawer as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is be willing to walk away from something you've built, especially when you're the only one who knows how to build it again. 14 years of loyalty taught me that dedication without recognition is worthless. But 14 years of building irreplaceable value taught me that the right ultimatum, delivered at the right moment, can transform exploitation into partnership. Sometimes the best way to get what you deserve is to show people exactly what they'll lose if they don't give it to you.